Okay, ladies and gentlemen, many sessions have been organized on sustainability during this WTO public forum, and this is one of them. My name is Wolfgang Niedermark. I'm member of the executive board of the BDI, the Federation of German Industry, and I'm really privileged to be your moderator today on our session on sustainability provisions in FTAs. And as usual, I would like to introduce my panelists first before we jump into our topic. And this is an interesting group from all parts of the world. So very representative for the WTO, which is also a true global effort. And next to me in person, face to face, and still wearing a mask, by the way, we are vaccinated here and have decided to take it off. We have a relatively very few people here in the room, so I think that's okay. And next to me is Alison Hamilton, and she is currently the WTO Deputy Permanent Representative for New Zealand. She was previously the New Zealand Chief Negotiator for Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and has worked with EU-New Zealand FTA negotiations, as well as TPP and CPTPP. Wow, all these complicated abbreviations. You are a true expert of trade negotiations, and we are proud to have you here on this panel. Next is Anna Stellinger. She serves as a Deputy Director General and Head of International and EU Affairs of the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, and as a member of the board at Business Sweden. And she has focused on EU trade and international affairs for 2 decades, most recently as Director General at the National Board of Trade Sweden. Welcome, Anna, from Stockholm. Then is Madeleine Tuninga already in? We welcome her. She serves as the head of the unit in the European Commission's DG Trade, Directorate for Multilateral Trade and Sustainable Development Policy, Green Deal and Conflict Materials. She previously led the Directorate for Trade Defense and has been with DG Trade in various positions for more than 2 decades, also a true expert on our topic today. And then last but not least, I send best regards to Ecuador, to Dulce Maria Garcia. Welcome. She serves as a Director of Negotiations of the Government Procurement and Intellectual Property at the Ministry of Production, Foreign Trade, Investment and Fisheries of the Republic of Ecuador. She's also the National Coordinator of Trade and Sustainable Development Subcommittee under the Multi-Party Trade Agreement with the EU, which means she is responsible for the implementation of various sustainability provisions in Ecuador. Then a technical note for our participants following on the screens virtually. Dulce will be speaking in Spanish and simultaneously interpretation will be provided. Make sure for this reason that your settings on the bar on your bottom of the screen is set to the language in which you would like to hear her remarks. So I think by the introduction of our speakers alone, it's clear what we are talking about. We are talking about sustainability provisions in foreign trade agreements and the related regulation network. According to WTO Regional Trade Agreements, RTA database, already 139 free trade agreements in force today contain environmental provisions. And another 86 of those contain labor provisions. So more and more countries begin to include sustainable development provisions in these bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements. And it becomes vital to discuss the way that countries can better align. Now, the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability have begun, and it's increasingly relevant to discuss the areas and provisions in FTAs. So, I look forward to these insights from the European Commission, from New Zealand, Ecuador, as well as a business perspective from Sweden, and perhaps from partners in the audience. And a last technical note before we jump in: you are invited to pose your questions throughout the session in the question field on the right of your screen. We will do our best to answer throughout the session, although we cannot guarantee we will get every single question here in this only 1 hour session. Actually, I wanted to ask my first question to Madeleine Tuninga, but she is not yet in, right? She is in. Okay, I cannot see her, but yeah, Madame Tuninga, Madeleine, you are the voice from Europe, from DG Trade. And can you shed some light from your perspective on the priorities of the TSD chapters in upcoming FTA negotiations and modernization from the EU side? How can these negotiations support our work better together with multilateral sustainability objectives? I'm always thinking about the India example, where we failed to continue our negotiations on an FTA because of these sustainability chapters, and now we have restarted. What makes you optimistic that this time it works better, and what are your strategies to make it feasible? Madeleine, please, the floor is yours. Is she really in? I still cannot see her. So she's not. Mrs. Tuninga from Brussels, are you in? Anna, would you like to take over this question from the European perspective? Because I think it's good to start from a. She's not in the session. Okay. So obviously, Mrs. Tuninga is not in this session, but we have a new European voice here at this table, Anna. From this European perspective, what makes you optimistic that these new provisions in upcoming negotiations, not new, we have heard that there are already many, but it seems to be difficult to make progress on that. So what makes you optimistic, and what is your perspective on European strategies to implement these provisions in upcoming FTA negotiations?
Well, thank you so much, Wolfgang. I can hear my voice bouncing back.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I have an echo here, so I hope you can hear me. I would not like to replace Madame Tuninga from the European Commission, because she has a much broader perspective on the free trade agreements and the TSD chapters. But very briefly, I can say a few words about that. And if you allow me, Wolfgang, after I'd like to say a few words about the TSD chapters from a pure business point of view.
Yep.
So when it comes to the free trade agreements, well, first of all, we need the free trade agreements agenda and negotiations to continue. From a European side, it's extremely optimistic. A very good thing that we have free trade agreements still being negotiated. We have the Mercosur being negotiated. We have New Zealand, we have Australia, and many more. And we just opened up the free trade negotiations with India. And of course, it's unimaginable today to have free trade agreement negotiations without TSD chapters. And that's perhaps where I could bring my more business point of view, why these TSD chapters are not just a good thing, but they are absolutely necessary thing and a prerequisite for free trade agreements to make sense, both for the public opinion, for governments, but also from a business perspective. Now, I keep hearing my voice in an echo. So I don't know if you can fix the if you could fix the audio.
Yeah. It's a pity that you have your echo yourself here. It's perfect. We hear you clearly.
I will try to fix it. There's still no tuning.
from our side, everything is perfect. We
Okay,
can
perfect.
hear
And
you
Madame
in
Tuninga
the-
is still not here.
No.
Okay. Would you allow me then, Wolfgang, to say a few words from the business perspective? And I hope that
Yes.
you join us and speak for the Commission. Even if we almost fully agree always with the Commission when it comes to the free trade agreements, it's still a different perspective from the inside and from the business community.
Yeah,
So if you allow me, first
same with
of
us.
all,
I understand your position.
yes. Well, first of all, if Madame Tuninga was here, I would compliment her and on the ambitious free trade agreement agenda of the Commission. And I think it's a very good thing that we're opening up for new trade negotiations. We need more free trade agreements around the world, both FTAs, also plurilaterals and multilaterals. But first of all, I would like, from a business perspective, go back to what should be obvious, and we sometimes seem to forget, and that is the very vital role of trade in itself. Trade for the sake of trade is a good thing, not just as part of a free trade agreement, not just as a part of TC chapters in free trade agreements, but trade for the sake of trade is a good thing. Now, why is that? Well, trade triggers growth. And we know that without growth, we cannot have any economic progress and we cannot have any social progress. But trade also contributes to jobs, good jobs all around the world. And this is true for developing countries, just like developed countries. We also know that jobs connected to trade are often more and better paid than jobs that are not connected to trade. If we look at my country, Sweden, more than 1.3 million jobs are underpinned by our exports to the rest of the world. And these firms are often more productive and they pay better salaries. But apart from good jobs and growth, we also, of course, know that trade in itself contributes to environmental sustainability. Now, why is that? Well, often it's embedded into the project or into the product. We can think, for instance, of goods like electric cars. We could think of goods like wind turbines, but also services like technological consultancy when installing, for instance, smart power grid. And also we need to remember that in order to combat climate change, we need innovation and we need good solutions and we need those innovations to travel the world. We need to put them on export, and all of this is impossible without trade. For an example, we just published a report at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise where we look at Swedish exports. And then we can see that our exports annually contribute to reduce greenhouse gases of 26 billion tons per year of CO2. And this is, I am sure, true for many other countries where we have a high level of innovation. What we also need to remember is that these things with innovation, new solution, qualitative jobs and growth is not possible if we don't have access to each other's countries, access to each other's markets. What I'm trying to get to here is that market access and trade in itself is a good thing for environmental sustainability. And therefore, we should not forget the T in the FTAs, and we should not forget the T in the TSD chapters, because trade in itself brings environmental sustainability. But we should not be naive, and of course we know that trade could also lead to very unfortunate and unsustainable and undesirable consequences. We can think of, for instance, exploitation of rainforests. We can think of child labor, forced labor in factories. And therefore, from the business perspective, we strongly support the introduction of TSD chapters in free trade agreements. And we want them to be ambitious and we want them to be far-reaching. This is a good thing. However, ambitions should not mean that the goals cannot be achieved. And it should not mean either that we have so ambitious free trade agreements or TSD chapters in free trade agreements that we cannot negotiate any free trade agreements at all. So we need to be realistic when it comes to the bar. We cannot rise it too high. We need to be ambitious and far-reaching, but it has to be reachable. And I think an important question is how to make these TSD chapters as efficient as possible, and also make them as compatible as possible with the global trading order. We need them, for instance, not to develop specific provisions when it comes to social sustainability. If we go into in the field of labor rights, for instance, I think the EU should continue what it's already doing, namely referring to and linking to core ILO conventions in the TSD chapter. In this way, we can avoid duplication and having one joint system, and at the same time we build upon, we link to the negotiations conducted by employers and labor unions. And when it comes to the environment, of course, we need to link the provisions to the multilateral environmental agreements, the UN, the Paris Agreement. So to say, from a business perspective, free trade agreements, the TSD chapters are a very necessary part, but we should not forget that trade in itself actually, rightly conducted, contributes strongly to environmental and social sustainability. So we need to get back to market access, and we need to get those free trade agreements in place. And from a business perspective, it's completely evident that high environmental standards is a good thing, both in itself, but let's be frank, it does contribute to business opportunities. And for companies who are in the forefront of innovation and new technological solutions, TSD chapters, ambitious TSD chapters can, so to speak, even be good for business. Now, other questions, Wolfgang, that I hope that we will be able to approach and discuss here today is how can we take those TSD chapters in the free trade agreements and bring them to Geneva? How can we multilateralize all the good things that we have in the free trade agreements and the sustainability chapters in the free trade agreements and bring them to a multilateral level? But I also hope that we will be able to discuss how to make these TSD chapters as ambitious and efficient as possible, and do we need sanctions in order to do so? But I will stop here for my introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna, for this very strong statement from, I would admit, a leader in sustainability. You are from Sweden with a strong industry, highly innovative, and of course you can come up with such a bold statement, and I think we need this kind of leadership. And that leads me, by the way, that's our ambition. Yes, later in this session we will discuss how can we bring up all these things you just mentioned to the multilateral level. But before we do so, we would like to listen to one of our partner continents in Latin America, exactly Ecuador, Dulce Maria Garcia. I introduced her. Listening to Anna now with this very bold statement, what is your perspective, being in a different situation? And how do you see this topic, and what is your perspective as a representative of a developing country on this matter? Dulce.
Muchísimas gracias, y antes que nada les extiendo un caluroso saludo desde Ecuador, y qué honor poder participar el día de hoy con ustedes. Como ustedes saben, todos los acuerdos comerciales de nueva generación incluyen no solo provisiones sueltas o buenas intenciones sobre el cumplimiento de los objetivos de comercio y desarrollo sostenible vinculados al comercio, sino que hoy por hoy contienen capítulos cada vez más exigentes que contemplan mecanismos para vigilar el correcto cumplimiento de los estándares de los compromisos internacionales en materia laboral, en materia ambiental, e incluso algunos en materia de igualdad de género y de conducta empresarial responsable. La firma del Acuerdo Comercial Multipartes para Ecuador, que entró en vigencia el 1 de enero del 2017, es decir, prácticamente hace 4 años, representó un hito muy importante para Ecuador, considerando especialmente que fue el primer acuerdo de nueva generación suscrito por el Ecuador, es decir, que contiene capítulo específico sobre comercio y desarrollo sostenible. Ha sido el primer acuerdo amplio y profundo en materia comercial, por lo que ha representado un importante reto y que sin duda ha traído resultados positivos para el Ecuador. El capítulo de comercio y desarrollo sostenible en el acuerdo comercial que tiene Ecuador evidentemente pretende garantizar el incremento del comercio y que éste vaya de la mano con valores como el trabajo digno, como la protección al medio ambiente, como la lucha contra el cambio climático. Pero para que ello se convierta en una realidad, se precisan cambios reales y duraderos, para lo que se requiere una implementación efectiva de las normas en materia social, en materia ambiental, para el beneficio de los ciudadanos, de los socios comerciales. Por ello, resulta fundamental que el comercio internacional y la sostenibilidad vayan de la mano. Pensaría que uno de los principales retos que hemos tenido para Ecuador durante estos primeros años de implementación de este acuerdo comercial ha sido la implementación de este mecanismo de diálogo con la sociedad civil, porque evidentemente para Ecuador y también para nuestro socio comercial, que es la Unión Europea, resulta indispensable mantener esta transparencia, mantener este proceso de consulta con la sociedad civil y que ellos evidencien también la realidad de los resultados de la implementación de estas disposiciones ambientales, laborales, de defensa de derechos humanos, etcétera. Por ello, cumpliendo la disposición 281 del acuerdo comercial, un año después de que nosotros entramos a firmar el acuerdo, es decir, en el 2018, logramos conformar un mecanismo de diálogo interno que mereció la felicitación de la Unión Europea para Ecuador, porque somos el único país andino que logramos constituir este mecanismo, que está conformado por 12 miembros divididos equitativamente por 4 miembros representantes de la sociedad civil, 4 miembros del sector laboral y 4 miembros del sector empresarial. Este proceso de diálogo básicamente busca lograr una adecuada comunicación y transparencia en la implementación de las disposiciones ambientales y especialmente también laborales. Considero que la exitosa conformación de este mecanismo valió gracias a 3 criterios que desde Ecuador utilizamos. Uno de ellos fue una difusión abierta. Nosotros realizamos una convocatoria completamente abierta y transparente, utilizamos comunicación y bastante publicidad para invitar a los miembros a que formen parte de este mecanismo. Otro componente fue una inclusión regional, es decir, una convocatoria orientada a todo el territorio ecuatoriano para que sea una convocatoria inclusiva. Y un factor importante también fue la no intervención del gobierno, es decir, fue la sociedad civil quien escogió sus propios representantes. Sin duda, la implementación de este mecanismo de diálogo ha resultado una verdadera oportunidad para lograr, mediante el diálogo proactivo y transparente de los actores, un adecuado entendimiento del título de comercio y desarrollo sostenible y que específicamente busca posicionar y dar un cumplimiento adecuado, transparente, equitativo de las disposiciones en materia ambiental, laboral y de responsabilidad social empresarial. Creo que es eso lo que podría aportarles hasta el momento. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Dulce Maria. Perhaps I may ask you, you have described that the civil society in your country, and the same is true for your government, is very optimistic and very supportive for all these provisions. Is it also true for all these owners of the plantations, the banana growers in your country? It sounds to me as if everybody in your country is fine with the development. Is that true, or are some people and some stakeholder groups challenging your way of introducing these elements into your policies?
Gracias. Bueno, definitivamente creo que la implementación en materia comercial evidentemente no ha sido igual fácil, si podríamos llamarla, o no ha brindado exactamente las mismas oportunidades a todos los sectores. Específicamente en el sector banano, las exportaciones han crecido muchísimo es uno de nuestros principales productos de exportación y ha sido un crecimiento constante. Sin embargo, sí, ha resultado complejo esta implementación o buscar este equilibrio entre las disposiciones laborales y ambientales, evidentemente con el crecimiento del comercio. Ecuador, durante los últimos 3 años, en el marco del Subcomité de Comercio y Desarrollo Sostenible, ha evidenciado ciertas quejas o rechazos desde algunos sectores, específicamente desde el sector de bananos, sobre supuestas violaciones o incumplimientos a los derechos laborales en el Ecuador, en el sector banano. Sin embargo, el Estado ecuatoriano es un Estado completamente garantista y tiene una carta magna que es nuestra ley, nuestra constitución y nuestro código de trabajo, que garantiza los derechos consagrados y aquellos que se promulgan en el título de Comercio y Desarrollo Sostenible, como la libertad sindical, como el derecho a la conformación de sindicatos, a la libertad de asociación, a la erradicación y a la no tolerancia del trabajo infantil. Por ello, Ecuador ha planteado enfáticamente sobre el cumplimiento irrestricto de los derechos laborales, pero evidentemente todos los sectores tienen el derecho de manifestar de plantear aquel sentir de rechazo o de cualquier falla que ellos puedan estar evidenciando. Gracias.
Yeah, thank you very much. Being part of the voice of the German industry, yes, we would like to be part of it, but we are normally hearing a certain claim that saying that we are overloading some FTAs, and listening to you, on the contrary, you are welcoming it, and that's good news and makes it easier to promote these kind of provisions. And I think what you just described from your government's point of view is really promising. And yeah, and we are on the same track here. Then thank you so far. And let's turn to Alison Hamilton. And I introduced her as a representative of New Zealand. And New Zealand is always a front runner in these matters, and you have formed an interesting alliance together with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, our host country here, and launched an initiative on ACCTS, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. That's an interesting initiative with an interesting club of people. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, and what is the special feature to form such a group to promote sustainability provisions in FTAs?
Great, thank you very much, Tēnā koutou katoa. Many thanks for the introduction, and a warm welcome to the other panelists, and a particular welcome to our colleagues in the room. It's really great to see you, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you. I want to start by noting that on this important topic of trade and sustainability, trade and sustainable development, that multilateralism remains our overarching goal. Multilateralism is always the first best option. And as Ms. Stellinger was saying, that's about bringing the FTAs, bringing our other work to Geneva, bringing it to the WTO. But with regret, we recognise that multilateral processes at the WTO are difficult, and members' ongoing negotiations on fisheries subsidies are just one example of that. So New Zealand is interested to find new ways to reach our goals in relation to trade and sustainability. And we think that by working with others through coalitions or smaller groups of the willing, we can show a pathway forward on how to address some of the difficult issues that have stalled multilaterally and build support over time. We've talked and heard a bit about the different options between bilateral free trade agreements, plurilateral processes, multilateral processes. For New Zealand, we don't see plurilaterals as competing with multilateral outcomes, rather we want them to be complementary. And we've designed some principles that sit behind our engagement to ensure that this happens. I'll just work through them very quickly. First, that initiatives should respond to business needs or global priorities, such as sustainable development. And from that perspective of business needs, I was listening with great interest to Ms. Stellinger's points around how sustainability provisions can be good for business. Second, that initiatives should be open, transparent, and inclusive in their working methods, and should keep the full WTO membership updated as a matter of course. Initiatives should support WTO institutions and involve the WTO Secretariat as much as possible. Initiatives should be high quality agreements with rules or commitments that go beyond existing WTO agreements and, where possible, beyond existing WTO offers that are on the table. Initiatives should have open accession clauses that allow any member that meets the required standards to be able to join. And finally, and certainly not least, initiatives should establish a clear and meaningful pathway towards multilateralism over time, using the WTO's institutions and rules to do so. We think that the inspiration can go in both directions. So, for example, the CPTPP, get the acronym wrong every time, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, contains fisheries subsidies negotiations and fisheries subsidies disciplines, sorry, and it does so in advance of the WTO negotiations reaching an outcome. In the reverse, the ACCTS, the ACS negotiations that you mentioned just earlier, draws on work that's been happening in the WTO and in work that has happened previously here, like in the EGA. So it works in both ways. They can inform in both directions. Speaking specifically on the ACS agreement and negotiation, it's designed to be a living agreement with its scope that could be widened in time, meaning that in the future, as new topics of interest are identified, they could be added to the process. It is open to any WTO member who wishes to join, who can meet the commitments. When negotiations were launched on the ACCTS, leaders were clear that the aim is to demonstrate in a concrete and substantive manner how trade measures and trade policy can support climate and environmental objectives and build towards that multilateral outcome. So the aim is to develop a pathfinder agreement that could eventually lead to those multilateral outcomes. Hence, the agreement is designed to be supportive of the multilateral rules and institutions. Speaking specifically to the group of members, it is a group of members that are all ready and willing to engage and to have the discussion and take on commitments. It's not necessarily a group that we've worked with before, but it's one that we are very proud to be working with in this particular context. Finally, a brief word on fossil fuel subsidy reform. You wouldn't be hearing from a New Zealand trade representative at the WTO without talking about fossil fuel subsidy reform. It's part of our duty. It's New Zealand's view that effective and long-lasting reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies needs to occur in the rules-based multilateral setting. So this is why New Zealand is once again leading efforts to issue a joint ministerial statement at NC12 on fossil fuel subsidy reform. But as I've outlined, it's important to continue our work across the range of different fora, including bilateral FTAs, the ACS, and other contexts that contribute to that ultimate goal of multilateralism. So we're also pursuing provisions and disciplines in relation to fossil fuel subsidy reform in those other contexts, as well as here in Geneva. Thanks very much.
Okay. Your point on the fossil fuel subsidies are well taken, so for the protocol here. And congratulations for handling these acronyms in a perfect way. I couldn't do that. True professional here. No, but seriously, it is interesting listening to you describing this coalition of willing. And Anna, we are close to your question about the compatibility with the WTO approach. So somehow that sounds to me that this is an extra track you're using here, since WTO is too slow. And Anna, you just introduced your very bold statement that, of course, we should strive for a multilateral approach and find a solution under the umbrella of WTO. So where is the solution now? Where is your stance? What makes you asking for simplicity at WTO level rather than joining this interesting initiative led by New Zealand. So, of course, industry representatives normally have a certain tendency to go for more simpler solutions, easy track. What is your stance here?
Thank you, Wolfgang. Well, I think when it comes to sustainability and trade, if you take a few steps back, it's a no-brainer that trade has to contribute to sustainable development. There is no other option. It must be one of the instruments, not the only instrument, but one of the instruments to be able to achieve all sustainability goals. But then again, how is it going to be done? And if there was a simple answer, even businesses would not be able to find it, because there is no simple answer to this question. When it comes to if we are going to work on sustainability chapters in free trade agreements, or lift it to the multilateral level, bring it to WTO and bring it to Geneva, there is no simple yes or no answer. I think what we need to do is to see that for some of the questions, we really should be able to, and we should have already been able to reach a few results. One result that should be easily achieved from our point of view is the environmental goods agreement. I know that it can be quite complicated in some countries, but from a business perspective and a Swedish perspective, of course we want an environmental goods agreement. And we also want to include services, because we want to make it simpler to promote trade in environmental friendly goods and services. We should also be able to have regulatory cooperation for circular economy. We need more circular economy. And we also need to address the subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, that should be possible on a multilateral level. But coming back to your question about what should be done in free trade agreements and what could be done at the WTO level, I think it's important that we look at the efficiency. From our perspective, it's more important that we do this in an efficient way than what exact structure is doing it. Let me just take one example. We have some parts of free trade agreements that could be very well done in free trade agreements, and other parts that would be better done at a multilateral level. Let's say that we have TSD chapters between the EU and some region, some country in the world. Perhaps this cooperation in certain free trade agreements needs to be built on trust. It needs to be built on a very close relationship and a very close cooperation. And that very close cooperation is perhaps difficult to do at the multilateral system. Let's not forget that free trade agreements are not just a paper being signed. It's cooperation for years and years and years ahead, where we have working groups, where we have common goals. And sometimes this is an efficient way to go ahead with the sustainability approaches. And let's also be frank, in some areas, for example, if we look at the rainforests, this is included more specifically in the Mercosur agreement being negotiated, because that's where the question of rainforests is the most important. Then again, we do not want, rather we can see that some of the sustainability issues to being discussed in free trade agreements would gain a lot from to be upscaled to the multilateral level, because we do not want separate bilateral solutions being developed. That would make it much more difficult to learn, to be open to new ideas, and to be able to find the common solution, the very common goals. Now, we talk about sustainability. So a brief answer would be, Wolfgang, that yes, let's bring to the multilateral level what can be brought to the multilateral level, but let's not underestimate the very high quality of the free trade agreements, where we have a very close cooperation built on this trust and on those working groups that are being developed. This can be difficult to upscale. But then we are talking about sustainability as if it was one thing. And I would like to make a small difference here between the environmental sustainability and the social sustainability. Now, environmental provisions are in general very suitable in both free trade agreements and multilateral agreements. I think they would even be more suitable in multilateral agreements, because climate challenge is global. We need global solutions, and here it should be a no-brainer that the World Trade Organization and all of us contribute into bringing in the solutions to climate change into the WTO. When it comes to the social sustainability, it's a little bit more complex, because social provisions are more complicated to bring into free trade agreements. We have different labor systems, we have different welfare systems, and they are intertwined in a country's history, in a country's culture and tradition. And that is much more difficult to bring into sustainability chapters. And there also, once again, we have the ILO, where we do have agreements made between employers and labor unions. So let's use ILO for that and link the free trade agreements to the core conventions of the ILO. But once again, let's be pragmatic. I think that the best solution would be multilateral for almost all of the questions, at least the environmental issues. And let's be very honest that trade and companies need to contribute more. But if it's more efficient in a free trade agreement, let that be it, because it does provide a very closer relationship and a very much closer cooperation between regions where there might be some issues like the rainforests that are specifically important in some regions and some agreements.
Thank you, Anna. And being a business representative myself, I could echo nearly everything you said. I'm a little bit more reluctant, not on myself, but our membership is on this environmental goods agreement. The definition is really complicated. What is an environmental good? And some people say nearly everything should belong to these definitions. And could you elaborate a little bit further on why you are so keen on the EGA from your point of view? Would be interesting.
Well, taking a few steps back, I think that when you look at clean energy, when you look at clean and new technologies, we need to make it easier and to trade simply. We need to reach more markets. We need to be able to make more innovations, more clean solutions. And of course, environmental goods would be a global good. It's beneficial for all of us. And we would even go so far as to include services in the environmental goods and to make them also tariff-free. So I have difficulties in understanding why making a clear definition would stop us from going ahead with the environmental goods. That could, I guess, easily, that needs to be solved, because making the trade and innovation cheaper and easier when it comes to environmentally friendly goods and services really is something that we all need to strive for, whether we are developing countries or developed countries, whether we are businesses or NGOs or governments. To us, that should be something obvious. Just like circular economy is something positive, just like subsidies on certain non-climate friendly products should be addressed. I think it's harder for me intellectually and us intellectually to understand why this would be difficult to move ahead with.
We don't want to dig into details now, but of course there are some questions about the definition of an environmental good. Of course, you could use steel in a very intelligent way to form lightweight constructions for vehicles and so forth, and that would even make classical steel an environmental friendly product. So, but as I said, we don't have time to dig deeper now. Actually, I wanted to ask now my next question to Dulce Maria, but I cannot see her on my screen. Did we lose her? Yeah, can you hear me, Dulce Maria? Because I wanted to address you on the new structured discussions, structured dialogue. European Union, New Zealand, and as well Ecuador are members of these new formats. And I wanted to ask you about your expectations in order to use this fora in order to solve these problems we just addressed, how to bring up these questions on the multilateral level, by using special formats like those. So what makes you optimistic that this is a good venture for Ecuador to be part of it?
Gracias, Wolfgang. Perdónenme un ratito porque estoy con eco. Gracias, mil disculpas. He apagado mi cámara porque estoy con el internet intermitente y se me estaba cortando constantemente, así que mejor me voy a mantener con la cámara apagada. Me pareció muy interesante la intervención de Ana. Definitivamente considero que es una inmensa oportunidad para todos los países. Hoy por hoy la sostenibilidad se encuentra impulsada en muchas de las políticas comerciales e impulsada por la agenda comercial de muchos países. En el caso de nosotros, de Ecuador, de ser un país en desarrollo, evidentemente buscamos estar alineados a la agenda comercial y aquellas nuevas disposiciones, por llamarles tal vez ambiciosas, de nuestros principales socios comerciales. Por ejemplo, la Unión Europea está construyendo esta ambiciosa iniciativa como lo es el Pacto Verde Europeo, que definitivamente cambiará eventualmente y implicará un reto importantísimo para los países en desarrollo y los países proveedores de la Unión Europea. Por ende, considero que el traspolar a nivel multilateral temas como los ambientales evidentemente es un reto y generará buenas oportunidades. Sin embargo, creo que es sumamente necesario determinar o construir importantes programas de cooperación. Es importante definir que no todos los países tendremos las mismas capacidades, oportunidades, la misma tecnología, el mismo nivel de innovación para poder adaptarnos a todos los cambios que se nos vienen enfocados en materia de sostenibilidad. Por eso sí me permito traer a colación que una de las principales tareas que sí lo dejamos a los países desarrollados y que también lo dejaríamos como una iniciativa importante que tiene la OMC es el generar programas potentes de cooperación para lograr una adecuada, justa y oportuna transición de los países en desarrollo precisamente a todas estas nuevas iniciativas. Me centro más en lo ambiental. En muchos países en desarrollo ya hemos comenzado a construir nuestras capacidades de exportación, por ejemplo, en productos preferiblemente ambientales, como los productos agrícolas, productos orgánicos, maderas certificadas, la acuacultura sostenible, fibras naturales, otros servicios incluso también como el ecoturismo o aquellos servicios de evaluación de impacto ambiental. Por ejemplo, es importante recalcar que Ecuador quizás es uno de los pocos países en el mundo que consagran un artículo específico en su constitución a las exportaciones verdes. El Ecuador en su artículo 306 de su constitución establece que el Estado promoverá las exportaciones ambientalmente responsables con preferencia en aquellas que generen mayor empleo y valor agregado, y en particular a las exportaciones de los pequeños y medianos productores y artesanos del Ecuador. Entonces, por ejemplo, nosotros hace un año cerramos un acuerdo comercial regional con Chile. En este acuerdo regional, por ejemplo, nosotros incluimos una disposición y se negoció una disposición que no fue fácil, pero finalmente se logró para lograr un reconocimiento mutuo de producción orgánica. Consideramos que temas como estos podrían resultar importantes y valiosos que se pueda trasladar también a una negociación multilateral. Pensamos que como les dije, no todos los países, especialmente aquellos en desarrollo, tenemos la misma capacidad o la misma oportunidad o rapidez para llegar a una adecuada transición. El que Ecuador tenga la necesidad de ir mutando, de ir transformando su producción cada vez más hacia una producción orgánica, evidentemente es un reto importantísimo, especialmente para los pequeños productores, porque esto evidentemente resulta en inversiones mucho más grandes, en contar con nuevas técnicas de producción sostenible, de ser amigables con el medio ambiente, de tener nuevos etiquetados, nuevos procesos, nuevas certificaciones, y evidentemente esto implica un reto de innovación, un reto económico importante. Entonces, por ello creemos que también a esto se le suma el componente de cooperación, que para países como nosotros es sumamente importante.
Thank you very much, Dulce Maria. That is really interesting to learn that you even have a constitutional provision for responsible exports. For me, it seems that Ecuador is really a very progressive approach into these topics, and it's really interesting to learn about it. Actually, I will do some research on that. Really interesting. But before we go on, I would also like to ask Alison what was the motivation of New Zealand to join this group for the structural dialogue, and what your expectations are, just to make this picture complete.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. The TESSD group is a really important step forward here at the WTO to be able to inject some concrete discussions and structure around the environmental issues and questions that we have to talk about. In the WTO structure, we have the Committee on Trade and Environment, which is a standing committee in Geneva that meets here in this building. And that has a broad work program to consider a range of different environmental issues. And one of the motivations and the rationale for joining the TESSD conversation is to really propel some of those issues forward and to bring some concrete deliverable around them. And the TESSD is starting to already do just that. So we're starting to see members have very focused discussions about some of the issues that are very significant. Things like circular economy, things like what to do on environmental goods and services. All of those questions are ones that the TESSD can cover if members are willing to do so. So that's part of the reason for us to join. We're also hopeful that the TESSD will enable groups of members who are willing and who want to go further to do just that, to use the discussions that they're having in the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment, in the structured discussions, and then think about what else or what more they might want to do together, and then bring them back to those structures to demonstrate what can be done. So it's all about the ultimate goal of multilateralism, but doing what you can with those who are willing now.
Okay. Thank you very much for this clarification. And we are running out of time, but there's time for one last question, perhaps to Anna. Actually, there are different ways of implementing and enforcing these provisions we are talking about. The EU FTAs and the TSD chapters, they have their own dispute settlement procedure. In the US MCA, for example, commitments on labor and environment are linked to the agreement's general dispute resolution system, which includes the possibility of imposing trade sanctions on the partner country that doesn't fulfill its commitments. Would this sanction-based approach work better or worse in a multilateral context than in an FTA context? What is your opinion on that, Anna?
Well, that's one of the very tricky questions that we have been trying to look at, all of us, I think, from different perspectives over the years. And basically, we have the US approach with sticks, and we have the EU approach with carrots. Now, which is the most efficient? Is it to have a big stick like the US has with the USMCA, or is the softer approach, the EU approach, with incentives, cooperation with governments, cooperation with civil society, capacity building, providing for learning processes, etc.? Which one is the most efficient? And I think it could be easy to think that a big stick would always be more efficient, but it's not that easy. There was just recently a study from the London School of Economics showing that there is no clear answer to that question. It depends on much other things than the agreement in itself. So it's impossible to say yes or no. But I would say one thing: this conditional market access that we saw in the Brexit agreement, the TCA agreement, should absolutely not be a model for the EU in the years and the negotiations to come. Because when we look at the Brexit agreement, there is a stick there, the EU-UK TCA agreement. It means that since the UK is so close to the EU and just left the European Union, there is a possibility of conditional market access, meaning that if the UK start to practice unfair competition to the EU, and the panel can actually state that there is unfair competition, the EU has the possibility, and the UK as well, to strike back, so to say. And what is very complicated is that the striking back is not necessarily supposed to be, doesn't have to be linked to the actual violation. So if the UK proposes or starts imposing or going down the road of unfair competition, the EU could, for instance, use tariffs, but in a complete different sector than the area where the violation was made. What is very tricky about this, and this is a stick, what's very tricky about this is that it actually means complete uncertainty for businesses. Businesses who are not at all involved in the sector where the violation has been made can be struck by tariffs from out of nowhere, and they have absolutely nothing to do with this unfair competition. So having these kind of sticks is unpredictable. And it poses true problems from a business perspective. So the message I would like to send is that until the stick theory or the strategy of having those sticks instead of carrots, I think we should be very cautious about introducing sanctions into our TSD chapters or into the WTO system. And one last thing, as I said previously, the free trade agreements is also a learning process. It's a cooperation. It's building trust between the EU on the one hand and the partner country on the other hand. And I am not so sure that it's efficient to have the threat of a stick or a sanction hanging over a cooperation which is supposed to be built on trust. So the jury is out, but I would say that until we have better research and we can prove that the sanction-based approach is more efficient, we should be very cautious.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this final remarks in the round of questions we have prepared. I have a full set of more questions. Did we receive any question from the audience virtually? That seems not to be the case. Anyway, we are running out of time. Oh no, there's one. Do you think the WTO rules should do no harm to sustainable development and the environment? Yes. Yeah, okay.
Let me try to take that. I think the response is, of course, that we should try to be designing trade policy and environmental policies that are mutually supportive, that we should be acknowledging the nexus between trade and environment and the benefits that trade can generate for the environment, and the fact that trade should be part of the solution. So rules should, in theory, if we are able to design them appropriately, should be able to ensure that we are meeting our environmental objectives. So that's how I would attempt to respond.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I think that makes the session complete. And we are back to the initial point of Anna, that trade is, of course, a strong element of sustainability. And we all remember well the good old Brundtland definition of sustainability, which is a triangle between environmental aspects, social aspects, and economic aspects. And this triangle must always be in balance, which is, of course, very complicated. But this should be always the goal we try to achieve. Yeah, thank you very much to all of my three participants here on this panel. Thank you very much for your contributions. We learned a lot. I hope it was also valuable insights for our audience. And perhaps I may repeat, if I haven't done so even, that this was not a venture by BDI alone. That was proposed by our colleagues from Sweden, Anna Stellinger from Sweden Enterprise and BDI. I think we will continue working on this topic. We are very progressive. You have talked about the coalition of willing. I think everyone here in this round was part of this coalition, and there's of course more to do, but everything I heard here today makes me really, optimistic that we are on the right track. Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you on other formats on the same topic and others. Thank you.